If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The Royal Air Force Engineering Bay in Yorkshire was never truly quiet. Even at night, the walls vibrated with the low, rhythmic thrum of aircraft engines somewhere out on the runway. The air smelled of kerosene, burnt oil, and cold iron. Inside, a single lamp swayed gently from the ceiling, casting uneven light across a cluttered workbench. Blueprints, grease-stained rags, small mirrors, and bolts scattered between open toolboxes. Clara Whitmore sat at that bench, sleeves rolled up, collar damp from sweat, and cold air mixing on her skin. She had been an optical engineer before the war, university trained, one of the few women who'd managed to keep her place when most were pushed aside. But the war had changed the rules. Now, with the Halifax bombers' losses climbing each month, the RAF design department had pulled anyone with a technical brain into whatever project might keep crews alive a little longer. Clara's assignment was both desperate and strange. Redesign the tail gunner's mirror system so the gunner could hold his aim through vibration and evasive turns. No one believed it could work. Her colleagues laughed behind her back. The Mad Mirror Girl, they called her in the canteen. Even the officers stopped, pretending her project was serious. But Clara stayed, driven not by approval, but by something she rarely said aloud. Her brother had died in a Halifax turret 6 months earlier, shot before he could even see the attacker coming. Sergeant Thomas Keene entered the workshop a few minutes past midnight, the door closing behind him with a heavy metallic sound. He was a tall man, lean and rigid, wearing an RAF jacket with the patch of a rear gunner. He'd been grounded after his crew was lost over Essen. Since then, he'd been assigned to technical support for ground testing, a quiet punishment for a man who refused to talk about what he'd seen. His job tonight was to assist Clara. She didn't look up at first. "You're late," she said, her voice flat, not angry, just tired. "Had to clear a part from stores," Thomas replied. His tone was calm, measured. He set a box of brackets on the bench and waited for instructions. They worked in near silence. The only sounds were the clicking of wrenches, the faint squeal of metal tightening, and the engine rumble beyond the walls. Thomas held a mirror frame steady while Clara adjusted the alignment screws. Her hand shook slightly. She blamed it on the cold, but it was stress. Each test that failed brought another report filed against her. Another look from the senior engineer suggesting she should be reassigned to clerical duties. Thomas watched her movements, quick, precise, but tense. He recognized the signs. It was the same kind of fatigue he'd seen in tail gunners before a mission, the mechanical focus hiding fear. "How long have you been at this?" he asked quietly. 72 hours, with some sleep in between," she said without looking up. He nodded once, silently impressed. She explained her design. A series of angled mirrors inside a stabilizing mount meant to reduce distortion when the bomber shook during evasive maneuvers. On paper, it made sense. In practice, no one had ever managed to stabilize a mirror in a vibrating turret. Still, she believed it could be done, and Thomas, though skeptical, had nowhere else to be. As he tightened the mounting bolts, he thought of the turret, of the way the whole world narrowed to a circle of glass and steel, and how the vibration blurred the horizon until the difference between sky and fire became impossible to tell. When he closed his eyes, he could still hear the gunfire, the sharp mechanical rhythm, and feel the helplessness of seeing tracer rounds coming closer with no way to evade. He didn't believe any mirror would change that. But watching Clara lean over her design, face pale with exhaustion and determination, he decided not to say so. The night dragged on. A draft slipped through the cracked window and blew across the table, fluttering the blueprints. Clara reached to steady them, her fingers brushing Thomas's wrist for a second. Both froze, neither spoke. Outside, a Halifax engine roared to full throttle, shaking the workshop. They both looked up instinctively, eyes following the echo. "That sound still gets to you," she said quietly. Thomas didn't answer. He just watched the lamp sway above them and gave a small nod. When a shift bell rang at 0300, Clara leaned back on her stool, rubbing her neck. The mirror mount was finally assembled. She looked at it with a mix of pride and dread. It could still fail like the last 3 attempts. But this one felt closer. She glanced toward Thomas. "Thank you," she said, softly, without formality. He gave a short nod, wiping grease from his hands. "I'll be here tomorrow. Might as well see if the damn thing holds." For a brief moment, something eased between them. The silence no longer sharp, just present. Two people with nothing left to prove except to themselves. Clara watched him leave, his boots echoing down the corridor, and turned back to the mirror. The reflection showed her tired face and the dim outline of the hangar behind her. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to think it might actually work. Then she blew out the lamp, and the room fell into darkness. The next evening, Clara returned to the workshop before sunset. The lamps were still off, the hangar cold and hollow. She placed her satchel on the bench, carefully unwrapped the mirror prototype, and checked every hinge and bracket one last time. Her handwriting from the night before, MK4 test unit, was still faintly visible on the frame. She hesitated before turning the light on, almost afraid the fragile hope she'd built overnight would fade once the hard work resumed. Thomas arrived quietly, his boots clicking against the floor. He had shaved, his uniform pressed, as if preparing for duty. "You didn't sleep," he said without looking at her. "Neither did you," she replied. Both knew it wasn't a question. They began to prepare the mock turret for testing, a hydraulic rig that replicated flight vibration. Thomas secured the unit to the mount while Clara adjusted the stabilizer screws. The whine of the motor filled the hangar, followed by the shudder of steel as the rig came alive. The mirror's image appeared on the testing screen, a simple white dot projected through a sighting lens to simulate a moving target. "Ready?" she asked. Thomas gave a short nod. He flicked the switch, and the rig began its first rotation. At first, the dot stayed stable. Then the vibration deepened. The mirror shivered. The white dot split into 2, then 3, scattering off-center. Clara's chest tightened. The metal couplings trembled harder, and with a sharp metallic crack, one hinge snapped free. The image collapsed into a blur. Thomas hit the stop button. The noise ceased instantly, leaving only the smell of burnt oil and the faint hum of cooling metal. Clara didn't speak. She stared at the shattered hinge, her breathing shallow. The failure wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to erase weeks of work. She felt the blood rush to her face, anger, humiliation, and exhaustion all tangled together. Every officer who doubted her, every whisper about the woman engineer who doesn't know when to quit, returned like an echo. She sank onto the stool, hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. "It shouldn't have failed," she said under her breath. "I recalculated everything." Thomas walked to the bench, lifted the damaged piece, and ran a thumb along the broken bracket. "Too thin," he said simply. The vibration tore through the joint. She looked up, eyes sharp. "It's aircraft-grade steel." He nodded. "Doesn't matter. The stress isn't even. You'll need dampers between the mounts." Clara exhaled hard. "If I add rubber dampers, I'll lose precision. The reflection angle will." "Shift," he interrupted. "Yes, but not enough to matter in combat. Better a small drift than a shattered frame." There was no arrogance in his tone, just experience. She studied him for a moment, realizing this was the first time he'd spoken more than a few sentences to her. His calmness steadied her frustration. Thomas began gathering tools without being asked. He filed the edges, adjusted the bolt holes, and slid a rubber spacer under the mounting clamp. His hands moved with the discipline of a man who'd once done everything with seconds to spare, a habit from combat maintenance. While he worked, Clara found herself watching him more closely than she meant to. The faint scars across his knuckles, the steady rhythm of his breathing. There was something about his quiet focus that made the room feel less hopeless. "Were you really a tail gunner?" she asked finally. He paused. "Yes." "What was it like back there?" He didn't look up. "Cold. Loud. Sometimes you couldn't tell if you were firing at them or at shadows. You don't see much. Just flashes. Then it's over." The way he said it made her throat tighten. She wanted to ask more, how he survived, what he remembered, but stopped herself. Whatever he had seen, He carried it alone. They rebuilt the prototype together. The new mount was heavier, slower to move, but sturdier. By the time they finished, dawn had crept into the hangar, pale and cold. The engines of bombers warming up outside shook the air again. The same sound as every night, but this time Clara noticed Thomas glance toward the sound, jaw tightening. "Do you still think about it?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. After a long silence, he said, "Every time I hear them take off." She nodded, not pressing further. The two of them watched through the small workshop window as another Halifax rolled down the runway, engines burning white in a morning haze. Inside, the repaired mirror gleamed faintly under the weak daylight. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the new bracket. "We'll test again tonight," she said, "and this time it'll hold." Thomas met her eyes. "It will," he said, steady and certain. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "I'll be here early." When he left, Clara stood in the empty workshop, staring at the bench. The exhaustion was still there, but it no longer felt like defeat. There was something different now. Not confidence, not yet, but the first sense of shared purpose. She reached for the file he had used and placed it back neatly in its drawer. The war outside would continue, planes would still fall, and the noise would never stop. But inside that small workshop, under flickering lights and cold air, two people had started to build something that might finally make a difference. The cold in Yorkshire had thickened by the third night. The wind pressed against the hangar doors, carrying the distant echo of aircraft warming for another bombing run. Inside the workshop, Clara stood at her bench, the new mirror assembly gleaming under the harsh lamplight. She checked every hinge, bracket, and bolt again. The rubber dampers Thomas suggested were holding, simple, ugly, but strong. It was the first time in weeks she had looked at the device and thought, this might actually survive. Thomas entered a few minutes later, stamping the frost off his boots. He set 2 mugs of tea on the bench without a word. They had fallen into a rhythm. She built, he tested, and neither needed to speak much. Clara was starting to understand his silence. It wasn't coldness. It was the way he kept his thoughts from collapsing inward. She'd seen that same quiet in factory men after a shift that went wrong. The kind of silence that protected what words could only reopen. "Ready for another run?" he asked. "Ready," she said, though her stomach turned slightly. They bolted the new system into the mock turret. The vibration test began. This time, the mirror held firm through the initial rotation. The projected dot on the screen stayed steady, shifting only a fraction with the movement. Clara's pulse quickened. For nearly a full minute, the image held its line. Then the machine jolted violently. A loose hydraulic fitting slammed into resonance. The test target drifted, blurred, then steadied again. The mirror frame creaked, but didn't break. Thomas leaned in. "That's the best we've seen." Clara exhaled. "It's not perfect." "It doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "It just has to keep them alive long enough." It was the first time she'd heard him say them. Usually he spoke about tail gunners as if they belonged to another world, a group he'd left behind. But now something had shifted. Before they could reset the rig, the base sirens wailed, a long, uneven tone that meant only one thing. Crash landing. Clara froze for a moment before instinct took over. She grabbed her coat and ran after Thomas, who was already sprinting through the corridor and out into the night. The airfield was chaos. Searchlights cut through smoke. A Halifax had come down just beyond the perimeter, one wing torn away, the fuselage half buried in the wet ground. Fire crews were shouting, hoses whipping under the pressure. The acrid smell of aviation fuel filled the air. Clara stopped short at the edge of the wreckage, heart pounding, boots sinking into the mud. She had never been this close to the aftermath. Thomas moved toward the tail section, ignoring the shouts to stay back. The rear of the plane was still mostly intact. He crouched near the twisted turret, shining a flashlight inside. Clara followed carefully, covering her mouth from the smoke. A young gunner, barely 20, was still in the seat, unconscious but alive, his arm burned, his oxygen mask hanging loose. Thomas unclipped him from the harness, murmuring low words that sounded more like habit than comfort. "You're all right. Easy now, you're fine." When medics arrived, They carried the boy away. Clara noticed the mirror mount inside the turret. Standard issue, cracked clean through. A design flaw she had been trying to fix for months had just failed in real combat. She felt sick. Was he? She started to ask. Lucky, Thomas said flatly. If the mirror hadn't shattered, he might have seen the attack coming. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the wreckage burn in the wet field. Around them, ground crews worked like ghosts in the floodlight beams, dragging hoses and shouting names. Clara's hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't from exhaustion. It was from clarity. The mirror wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was a matter of survival. Back in the hangar hours later, the smell of fuel still on their clothes, she sat on the floor near the bench. Thomas stood over the half-disassembled test rig, staring at it as if deciding something. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. I'm putting my name down for the flight test. Clara looked up sharply. You're grounded. They won't approve it. I'll make them approve it, he said. They need someone who knows the turret. Someone who's seen what happens when it fails. She stood tense. That's not your job anymore, Thomas. You've done your part. He met her eyes. Then whose job is it? A kid like that one tonight. The anger in his voice wasn't at her. It was at the system, at fate, at everything that left men in those turrets blind. She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't have to go back, but she knew it wouldn't matter. His decision was already made. Finally, she said softly, if you're going to fly it, then I'm going to make sure it's worth it. They spent the next day rebuilding the mirror assembly from scratch. Clara redesigned the internal angles, layering 3 small mirrors at fixed offsets to correct for vibration distortion. Thomas reinforced the mounting bracket with new dampers scavenged from an old undercarriage strut. They worked without rest, the hangar empty except for the hum of electric lamps and the sound of tools striking metal. When dawn broke through the workshop windows, the prototype was finished. The new model looked heavier, almost crude, but it was solid. Clara set her hand on the cool metal and whispered, more to herself than to Thomas, "It'll hold this time." Thomas wiped the oil from his hands and looked at her, expression steady but tired. "If it doesn't," he said, "then we'll fix it again." For the first time, she smiled, small, weary, but real. It wasn't hope she felt, not exactly. It was purpose. And in wartime, that was enough to keep them both standing. Outside, the engines of another bomber squadron started up, echoing across the frozen fields. The sound was no longer something to fear or mourn. For the first time, Clara listened without flinching. She understood now why he stayed near those sounds, why he refused to leave the airfield. It wasn't punishment, it was duty. The mirror glinted under the light as the hangar doors opened for morning inspections. Tomorrow, they would bring the device to the flight line for its first real test. And this time, they both knew what was at stake. Not theory, not reputation, but the difference between a man seeing death coming and seeing a way to survive it. The morning of the test was windless, the sky pale and cloudless over the Yorkshire fields. A thin frost still clung to the tarmac when Clara arrived at the airfield. Her hands were wrapped around a notebook, her face drawn but steady. The mirror system, now designated the MKV unit, had been installed overnight into a Halifax tail turret by the base mechanics under her supervision. She had barely slept. Every bolt, hinge, and bracket had been checked twice. Thomas stood near the aircraft, speaking with the flight officer. He was already in gear, flight jacket zipped, helmet under his arm, eyes clear but unreadable. He wasn't supposed to be flying. Clara knew the rules. Grounded men didn't volunteer for live tests. But the officer in charge had quietly approved the request, partly because Thomas had experience, partly because nobody else wanted to risk being inside a prototype turret if the glass or mount failed mid-flight. When he saw her approach, he nodded once. Final adjustments? All done, she said. The stabilizers have a new locking joint. It'll compensate for pitch drift. He gave a faint, approving smile. You sound like command. She looked at him seriously. Just make sure you come back. He didn't promise, but his expression softened enough to say he'd try. At 0900 hours, the Halifax's engines came alive for deep roars shaking the ground. Ground crew pulled the chocks, and Clara stepped back with a clipboard pressed to her chest, watching the aircraft taxi down the runway. Steam rose off the exhaust pipes in white bursts. She caught one last glimpse of Thomas climbing into the narrow tail section, bending low to fit through the access tunnel. Inside the turret, Thomas locked the hatch and ran his hands over the controls. Everything was cold and tight. The new mirror mount gleamed under the light coming from the tiny canopy above. He adjusted the guns, checked the sights, and felt the aircraft's vibration as it began to roll. He wasn't supposed to be nervous. He'd flown hundreds of hours before, but this was different. He wasn't armed for war. He was carrying someone else's hope. The Halifax lifted into the air, climbing smoothly. Clara followed its ascent from the ground until it became a dark silhouette against the rising sun. She listened to the radio headset in the operations bay as the test team reported positions and data. Static filled most of the line until Thomas's voice came through, steady, professional, calm. Turret aligned. Sight clear. Starting yacht test. The pilot rolled slightly left, then right. Clara waited, breath shallow. Image stable, Thomas reported. No distortion. She closed her eyes, letting the relief sink in for a second before the next command came through. The pilot increased throttle, simulating turbulence. The aircraft shuddered violently. Clara gripped the edge of the console. Mirror vibration minimal, Thomas said after a pause. Still holding alignment. Beginning mock target engagement. Another aircraft, a stripped-down trainer fitted with a sleeve target, entered formation from the rear. Through the turret's modified scope, Thomas tracked it. The mirror didn't slip. The reticle stayed fixed. He squeezed the trigger for a dry run. The tracking camera in the Halifax recorded the aim points. Target lock maintained, Thomas reported. His tone shifted slightly, almost disbelief. Tracking accuracy improved. It's holding through sideslip. In the operations bay, Clara finally let herself smile. The crew around her exchanged quiet looks, a kind of restrained amazement. She took notes quickly, recording every phrase, every confirmation. The pilot called in the final maneuver, a roll and dive to simulate evasive action. The Halifax tilted hard, the tail swung. Inside the turret, the world blurred for a second, then steadied again through the mirror's stabilized image. Thomas adjusted the sight line and centered it again, amazed that the view stayed clean. For the first time since his crash months ago, he could see clearly under motion. No blur, no double image. Control, this is Keen, he said. Accuracy test complete. Mirror system fully operational. Recommend approval for field use. There was a pause on the radio, then a burst of applause from the crew in the hangar. Clara set the headset down slowly, unable to speak. Her body was shaking, the mix of exhaustion, pride, and disbelief tightening her chest. When the Halifax landed, she ran out to the runway with the rest of the ground team. The engines shut down one by one. Thomas emerged last, climbing out of the turret, his face pale but composed. The cold air bit at his skin as he stepped on his solid ground. How was it, she asked. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. It works. Better than I thought possible. Clara exhaled, her eyes lowering for a second as the tension left her shoulders. So it's real now, she said quietly. It's real, he replied, and it'll save lives. The base commander arrived soon after, reviewing the data. The test results were undeniable. Defensive accuracy up 5-fold. Stability under motion unmatched by any previous system. Production orders would follow within days. As the crews began to disperse, Clara stayed beside the aircraft, staring at the mirror unit gleaming in the tail section. The invention that had started as an impossible idea, mocked and dismissed, was now a proven system. She felt no triumph, only a quiet, heavy satisfaction, the kind that came from knowing something truly worked and that it mattered. Thomas stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. You did it, he said. She shook her head. We did it. For a moment, they just stood there, watching the plane in silence. The winter sun hung low behind the clouds, turning the frost into a silver haze across the airfield. The noise of the engines had faded, replaced by the soft hum of wind over steel. Thomas turned to her. What's next? Clara's answer came without hesitation. Production. Training. Every Halifax we can reach. She paused, glancing at him. And then, maybe I'll finally sleep. He smiled, faint but genuine. You've earned it. But she could tell from his eyes that neither of them would rest easily. Not yet. They both knew what that mirror really represented. For the men who would sit in those freezing turrets, it wasn't an invention. It was the difference between dying blind and dying with a fighting chance, or maybe, if fate allowed, living long enough to come home. As the daylight faded, Clara lingered near the aircraft until the hangar lights flickered on. The war would go on, but something inside that machine, something made by human hands, human grief, and human persistence, would make it a little less cruel. And for the first time since her brother's death, she no longer felt powerless. 2 weeks after the successful test, the workshop had transformed. What was once a dim, half-empty space full of discarded blueprints and broken brackets was now alive with movement. Tables were lined with mirror assemblies, each numbered, polished, and stamped for field distribution. The new system had been officially approved for squadron use. Orders arrived daily from RAF stations across the country. Clara oversaw every inspection personally, refusing to let anyone sign off a unit she hadn't checked herself. Thomas remained by her side through all. Though the base commander had offered him the chance to return to active flight status, he declined. I've done my share up there, he said simply when asked. I could do more good here. It wasn't pride or fear. It was a quiet choice made by someone who finally understood where he could be most useful. Each morning began the same. The hiss of soldering irons, the rhythm of wrenches, and the steady hum of new parts being assembled. Clara and Thomas often worked in silence, broken only by the occasional instruction or a brief exchange about angle tolerances. The mirror had passed every test, but Clara refused to treat it as finished. She adjusted small details, refining the lock tension, thickening the support frame, improving visibility under glare. She wanted the design to be foolproof, simple enough for even a tire mechanic on a field base to install correctly. On the third morning, a letter arrived from the front lines, typed on smudged paper, signed by a gunner from 76 Squadron. It said the new mirror gave me time to see them coming, to fire first, and to still be here writing this. Clara read it twice, then folded it neatly and pinned it above her desk. No one in the workshop spoke, but the sound of tools resumed with renewed focus. By late February 1944, the first production batch was complete. Dozens of Halifax bombers now carried the mirror system in their turrets. Reports came in steadily. Cleaner tracking, better defensive accuracy, fewer surprise attacks. The numbers spoke for themselves, 5 times the engagement precision compared to standard mounts. For the first time in months, Clara began to believe that what she'd done wasn't just an experiment, but something that genuinely changed the outcome of missions. Still, she hadn't forgotten how it started. The laughter in the canteen, the mad mirror girl whispers, the forms marked low priority. Those voices were gone now, replaced by new ones asking for her schematics and advice. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even smile when the commander presented her with a commendation. Instead, she handed it back for safekeeping and said quietly, "Just make sure they keep working." That night, the base was calm. Most of the aircraft were grounded due to fog. The hangars stood half-lit, the silence broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. Clara sat on the edge of a workbench, coat draped over her shoulders. Thomas joined her with 2 mugs of tea. They didn't talk for a while. The kind of quiet they shared wasn't awkward anymore, it was earned. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked finally. He took a slow sip, eyes fixed on the dark outline of the airfield. "I tried. The noise follows you, even when you go home. But here, it feels like I'm doing something that matters." She nodded. "Me too." They sat there in silence, the fog rolling past the hangar door. It was the first peaceful evening either of them had known in months. The war still raged somewhere over the channel, but in that small corner of Yorkshire, time had slowed. The next morning brought another delivery order, larger than any before. Production was being expanded to include every Halifax still in service. Clara's mirror system would now be standard equipment. She didn't say anything when the message arrived. She just placed it next to the letter from 76 Squadron and began preparing the next shipment. When the war finally ended the following year, the workshop fell silent again. Many of the engineers were reassigned or sent home. Clara stayed for a while, helping dismantle the test rigs, storing the last of the spare parts. She received offers from London, even one from a civilian optics company in Manchester, but she refused them all. Thomas stayed too, taking a job training new ground crew, teaching them how to care for the turrets and mirrors that had kept so many alive. Years later, when the airfield was turned into a museum, one of the surviving Halifax bombers was restored and placed on display. Its tail turret, still fitted with Clara's mirror, gleamed under the lights. A small plaque beneath it read, "Stabilized Reflective System, developed by the Engineering Division, RAF Yorkshire, 1943. It didn't mention names, but those who knew understood who had made it possible. On opening day, Clara and Thomas stood side by side in front of the exhibit. Visitors passed by, taking photographs and murmuring softly. The air smelled faintly of oil and old steel, memories preserved in metal. Thomas looked at the plaque, then at her. "Not even your name," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "Doesn't need to be. The right people came home. That's enough." Outside the museum, the wind moved gently over the empty runways. The world had changed. The sounds of engines, sirens, and distant bombing runs were gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of ordinary life. Clara and Thomas walked to the end of the field, the same path they used to take after long shifts years ago. The evening light fell across the horizon, turning the frost to gold. They stopped, watching the sky, the same sky that had once taken everything from them and then, in a quiet way, given something back. Thomas reached for her hand. "You ever think about what's next?" She looked at him, calm and certain. "No," she said. "For the first time, I don't need to." They stood together as the sun sank behind the hangar roof, the reflection of its last light glinting faintly on the surface of a single mirror, one that had changed the fate of countless men and, without them ever saying it aloud, bound two lives together through shared silence, work, and understanding. The war had ended. Their story had not. But for the first time, it didn't need to continue. It was whole.